Hey everyone, and welcome to another Mammoth Interactive tutorial on elements of the Swift 3 programming language. This tutorial will focus on functions in Swift 3, and we are in the playground right now. I just called this this file functions or rather intro to functions. And so what we're going to do is I'm just going to briefly describe what a function is, how it works, and then I'm going to let the rest of the tutorial do the work. Okay, so I'm not going to do a whole lot of explaining right now, just going to kind of give you the basic rundown so that you know kind of what a function is going in. So functions, and I'm going to write this comment, functions are kind of blocks of code that execute a task or tasks, and basically can be called, let's just say numerous times, let's say multiple times to perform that same task. Okay, so basically they contain a block of code which usually performs some kind of a task. So this could be variable assignment, this could be some kind of a calculation using an equation or something, this could be looping through a bunch of code, this could be really anything. And the great thing about functions is that we can just build the function once and fill it with as much code as we want, and then all we have to do is we have to call that function name and it will execute that same code every time without having to write out, as many lines as we put within that function. Okay, so I'm going to write another comment, useful for containing a loss of code that needs to be executed many times, as we can just populate a function with code and call the function name to perform that task over and over again. Okay, so let's take a look at what a function might look like, and there's a few things to note. So in Swift 3 we call functions by calling the func operator. So right here, if we call function, and then we'll give the function some name, so name of function. And then in these then we'll set these brackets up here, and usually there are parameters. Well, not usually, but if we had parameters we would put them in there. And then there'd be some kind of a return type maybe, and then the body of the function goes here. Okay, so all functions will have a name. Typically the name of functions are action words, because they're doing something, they're performing some kind of a task. And now that task can be big or it can be small. The task can be as simple as kind of assigning a variable a value, or the task could be huge, it could take up many lines of code. Okay, so generally it's good practice to keep your functions as simple as you can and to not overburden them with many tasks. Okay, so again, make your name indicative of what the function is doing, and in here we can put parameters. So these are, I'm just going to say parameters, I'm just going to say a parameter, and then the type. So what I mean by a parameter is typically it's going to be some variable or a function or something that we pass in, and then we can use that, and when it gets passed in as a constant. And then we can use that throughout the function. So what we can often do is we will call a function with a parameter inside of it, and then we can use that parameter within the function to maybe perform some kind of calculation or help with some kind of reassignment, or it just helps with the task. We'll see more about that in the future parts of this tutorial. And basically we'll have a return type here. And so basically what this return type is if there is a return type, the function will call return, and then some value to return. So what we'll have is basically if the function has a return type, then whenever the function is called, it will spit out some kind of value here, and this value will be this. So often, but not always, this value is some kind of a variable. So maybe it has a return type of integer, and it's spitting out a 5. So at the very end it will return a 5. That means that the 5 that is returned when the function is called needs to be stored or used somewhere. Okay, so what we could do is maybe just one example is if we have like an integer result which doesn't have a value, we could set integer result be the value that's returned by some function that adds two numbers or something. Okay, so not all functions have parameters or return types. Some have both, some have only one, and some have neither. And that's fine. So functions can have parameters or not, but we always specify the parameter name and then the type with this convention. And same with if we call the name of the function. So if we were to call name of function, and I know it's giving us errors right now, but then if we were to call it with a parameter, we would have to say parameter equal to some value, let's just say 6 or something. Okay, and then we would have to set some variable equal to the return type of that. But basically this is how you declare your function, and this is the implementation when you actually give it a function body, and then this is calling the function. Okay, so 3 parts. The declaration is just the name, return types, and parameters. The implementation is the actual body of the code performing the task, and then the function call is just calling the name of the code with or name of the function with the parameters specified. Okay, so we'll get more into detail of functions without parameters, then functions with parameters, and functions with return types, and then kind of a mix of everything. Okay, so really useful. Functions are pretty much the building blocks of your code, and everything really needs to be kind of in a function at some point. Okay, so I'll let you guys get to it. Hope you enjoy this tutorial, and yeah, so we'll begin with some basic void, return type, and no parameter functions. Okay, so now we're just going to see how a basic function works. So we're just going to build this very simple function. It's not going to have any parameters, and it's not going to give a return type either. So it's not going to take anything in, and it's not going to spit out any value. It's just going to perform a simple task which we will assign to be a print function. Okay, so this isn't so different from the actual print function itself, but I'll show you how functions can be a lot more useful than just calling, in this case, the print function over and over again. Alright, so now we've seen what a basic function is and what it can do. Let's take a look at one in action. So this is not going to have any parameters, and it's not going to have a return type either. It's just going to be a very simple function that's just going to print something out for us, okay? So let's set this up. We'll call the function, and then let's give it a name. And I'm just going to call this print something, because that's exactly what it's going to be doing. And remember, you want to make your function names indicative of what they're doing, and preferably verbs as well, because functions perform an action, they kind of do something, so it's more appropriate to call it an action word. So because it's going to print something, I'm going to call it print something. Okay, so again, no parameters. I'm going to exclude this arrow here because we're not having a return type, and just going to open the braces there. Okay, so we have a function name, we have called the function operator, we have no parameters and no return type. So what do we want this to do? What do we want to put in the function body? Well, this is just going to print something, so let's call the print function itself. And what should we have in here? Let's just have it say Mammoth Interactive for now. Okay, so it's a very basic function, and we can do pretty much the same thing by just taking it out there and just calling it down here. However, that defeats the purpose of our tutorial, and what if it was something a lot more complicated than just a simple print statement? Then it becomes really annoying to have to type out this code every single time you want to have it called. And that's the whole purpose of having these functions, is that I can just call print something, if I can spell it correctly, and it performs all the work for me. So you'll see once we run it, or once it decides to run. And there we go. See, we have Mammoth Interactive printed there. Okay, so although typing this out really wasn't much more work than typing this whole statement out, if we have a lot of different tasks being performed, it's a lot faster just to call the function name itself, rather than to have to go through this process every single time. And especially if our function name is something short like this, if it's just a P, then it's definitely going to be faster to type out the function name and call that than to perform this task every time. So this is just a very simple function. This is an example of kind of what it can do. So we can call it again, print something, and again we can call it as many times as we want, and it's just going to perform the same task for every single time that it's called. Okay, so this is just a basic function. To recap what we've seen, we have our function, we have a name. Again, make sure that it's indicative of what the function is doing, and preferably an action word. And we have no parameters, no return type. We're just having this function print this statement. Okay, so we could have done the same thing by taking this line out and putting it here, but for the sakes of our tutorial, we just put it inside a function and called that, because in this case it doesn't make that much difference, but in most cases it will be a lot faster just to call the function name. Okay, so next time we'll be looking at a function that will do something a little more interesting than just this print statement. Okay, so now we just saw how a basic function works. So this was a very simple function again. It had no parameters or return type. All it did was we told it that it's going to print out Mammoth Interactive. So within the function itself, it just had the call to the print function. So this is something that we could have done without designing this whole function called print something. We could have just called the print function on Mammoth Interactive every time if we wanted, and in this case it wasn't much more efficient to do either one, but I explained that often it is faster to call a function that performs this particular task rather than explicitly calling that same task every time, and we'll see a little more about why this becomes important coming up.